Hi, welcome back. This is our second video in the series on basic formal logic, an open introduction using the textbook For All X, the Lorain County remix. If this is the first video you're watching, you should actually skip back and go watch part 1. So, in this section, we're going to be covering chapter 1.2 in For All X. We're going to be talking about statements, arguments, premises, and conclusions. Now, to study logical argument formally, we're going to need to be more precise. We've been doing things sort of informally to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing, but now we need to be a bit more precise because we're going to start introducing more formal things. Now, we previously defined an argument in the last video as a set of connected statements that establish a conclusion, but we never defined what a statement was. Well, a statement is a unit of language that can be true or false. Now, the premises and conclusion of an argument always need to either be statements, they always need to be statements, and statements are always either true or false. They can't be unknown, uncertain, they can't represent a range of mathematical values. There are logical systems that go beyond the binary true or false, but we're not going to be dealing with them in an introductory course. But if you're interested, you can Google fuzzy logic and take it from there. A statement in philosophical logic simply makes an assertion that we can agree or disagree with. It will always either be true or false. There is no third value. The fact that there's no third value is actually pretty important moving forward. Now, the statement could be about anything, as long as it's capable of either being true or false. It could take what we're going to call a truth value. So the following are all examples of statements. The Tyrannosaurus rex went extinct 65 million years ago. Radiohead is a better band than Mumford & Sons. Property-owning men should not have the right to vote. So, notice these are actually three different kinds of statements. Right? One seems to be empirical. The other one seems to be an aesthetic judgment, like an opinion of my musical preferences. And the third one seems to be like a moral or political statement. Now, these are three really different kinds of statements, but that doesn't matter to us. What matters is that we can agree or disagree with them. You might think there's no fact of the matter about Radiohead and Mumford & Sons, but that doesn't matter as long as we can assign them a truth value somehow. It doesn't matter if we think it's a fact, an opinion, a moral view. But we're not going to be talking about like philosophical questions like the metaphysics of what constitutes a truth value, or what makes something true or false, if it's in the domain of opinion or morality. All we need to agree on for now is that statements A, B, and C can be reasonably held to be either true or false. It's something you can argue over. It'll be different in that sense from an opinion. An opinion will be different in that sense from a question. A question isn't true or false. It's a query for more information. But an opinion, somebody go, I disagree with you. Well, if something makes you want to disagree with it, then it's a statement capable of having a truth value. So the contrast here, I think, is really useful to try and understand the difference, right? Do you think Kid A is the best Radiohead album? That is not a statement. A fragment, such as metal, hip-hop, country, well, that doesn't make a full statement. An order, stop listening to Nickelback this instant. Ouch, right? None of these things are statements capable of having a truth value. They can't be used as premises in an argument, and they're not something that I can go, I disagree with you. Ouch, I disagree with that ouch. I mean, I guess if you're a soccer player and you're like, oh God, I've been hit, and then you could say, I disagree with you, faking. But let's not try to be too obtuse about this. Common sense will be enough to say and determine whether or not something counts as a statement. And as we get more abstract and more interested in the formal system of logic, whether or not an English or natural language phrase counts as a logical statement is going to be less and less important. It's going to be important for now as we make the transition from taking natural language and then talking about a formal logical system. So, how do we identify premises and conclusion in an argument? So let's read this passage from Peter Singer, quoted again in For All X. So Singer says, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do so. Famine is something bad, and it can be prevented without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. So we ought to prevent famine. So is this an argument? If so, what are the premises? What is the conclusion? Well, now we can put them in kind of standard form, separate out the premises for the conclusion. The conclusion indicator, so, tells us that that's the conclusion the author intends us to draw from the premises. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, we ought to do so. Famine is bad. It can be prevented without sacrificing anything of importance, or at least comparable importance, so we ought to prevent famine. That's Peter Singer's argument. So the idea behind standard form here, where I separate premises from conclusion, is that we're going to identify the premises, separate out from the conclusion for clarity and understanding exactly how the premises support the conclusion. So is this a valid argument? If you look at the structure, yeah. Is it sound? Well, you might dispute the premises on the basis of whether or not they are in fact true. Remember, validity is not about whether the argument is a good argument and the premises are in fact true. Validity is an abstract concept that is content neutral that says if the premises are true, the conclusion follows. Now, the nice thing about validity is that if it's not the case that the argument is valid, you don't even need to argue about whether the premises are in fact true in the world or not. You could just say, that's an invalid argument. Even if the premises were true, the conclusion wouldn't necessarily follow. Now that's nice because the debate of whether the premises are in fact true in the world is usually more difficult to debate than finding out that the argument is invalid. If you find that an argument's invalid, end of discussion. That's pretty useful. Here's another example from the book. The new budget underscores the consistent and paramount importance of tax cuts in the Bush philosophy. I guess that would be George W. Bush, who was president 20 years ago, something. I'm old. Now, his first term cuts affected more money than any other initiative undertaken in his presidency, including the costs thus far of the war in Iraq. All told, including tax incentives for healthcare programs, the extension of tax breaks that are likely to be taken up by Congress, the White House budget calls for nearly $300 billion in tax cuts over the next 5 years, $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So, if we put this argument in standard form, which statement is the conclusion, which is the premise? So the conclusion can end up wherever. In this case, the conclusion is actually the first sentence. The conclusion is this new budget underscores the consistent and paramount importance of tax cuts in the Bush philosophy. And premise 1 and 2 are kind of evidence for that. Now, is this a deductive, valid argument? No, not exactly. But the point here is that the conclusion can end up anywhere. So the following are examples of conclusion indicators. So you could find conclusions when you're looking at a passage of text and putting it in standard form. For example, we have therefore, hence, consequently. It follows that. In conclusion, accordingly. Now, conclusion indicators are important, not just because they tell you which statement is intended to be the conclusion, but sometimes series of statements are not arguments at all, but merely expressions of belief. However, a conclusion indicator will tell us that the speaker is in fact making an argument and not just expressing an opinion or giving you information. Now, here's a place where I'm going to stop, and I'm not going to give you the answers for this one, but I urge you to pause the video and go to section 1.2 in For All X and answer all the questions in section A and B and choose 2 from C. And that's pages 12, 14 in my version, but the pagination might have changed, so just check that it's 1.2, sections A, B, and C. Go ahead and do that. You pause the video. 2 fish find themselves in a tank. One says to the other, "Do you know how to drive this thing?" Great joke. Okay. So not everything is an argument. An argument is a series of connected premises establishing a definite conclusion. Now, all arguments will be made of connected statements. Not all connected statements, however, are arguments. So, conclusion, only some sets of connected statements are arguments. That's a good argument itself. If a passage is an argument, it is made of connected statements. This narrative passage is a set of connecting statements. Therefore, this narrative passage is an argument. It's kind of a funny meta joke here, right? So the first argument here is a good argument. It's valid. The second is not. But whether or not it's valid or not doesn't change the fact that it's an argument. However, not all collections of statements are arguments. Sometimes just they're collections of statements. So statements of personal belief can be persuasive. They can play a rhetorical role, but they're not necessarily going to be arguments that we're going to analyze in terms of its deductive structure. So Martin Luther King said, "I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there's still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice, lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations, can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." Now that's a very persuasive piece of rhetoric from a very famous speech. But is it a deductively valid argument? No, it's not supposed to be, and we're not going to try and find the conclusion and the premises and the logical structure here. So it's important to keep in mind that there's a difference between arguments and other statements of belief, or just kind of information dumps. So exposition is also not an argument. So here's also an example from For All X. Einzek advocated 3 major behavior techniques that have been used to treat phobias. They're modeling, flooding, systematic desensitization, and then there's some explanation about what this means. But again, this is an exposition dump. It's not an argument. So not every connected series of statements is an argument. So although this paragraph is made up of statements that could be true or false, it's not driving towards a conclusion with logical structure. So not every piece of talk, rhetoric, exposition, information is going to necessarily be an argument that we're going to analyze. So the distinction between what counts as an argument and what's not an argument in natural language is actually going to be kind of difficult. It's going to be contextual. Providing examples of a general claim could be expository, or it could be an argument, depending on the speaker, the audience, the context, and there's no real way to kind of logically sift that out. From our standpoint, establishing general claims from individual pieces of evidence is typically an inductive process anyway, not deductive, and we're not going to encounter this problem very often. So if you're reading For All X and you're on that page 17 or so, identifying arguments and expositions is not something I'm going to be focusing on right now. We're just going to present it. I'll tell you when there are arguments, and then we're going to work on analyzing the logical structure. The point of this was just really to say that not every series of connected statements is necessarily an argument. Not every explanation is an argument either. These are different from arguments that offer context and information about something we already know to be true. They're not establishing some new statement on the basis of premises. So if I say, somebody says, "Oh, your plants are dead." Well, it's because I never water them. So Steve's explanation here is not an argument. We're not trying to deduce the status of the plants from the evidence, but to explain their status, which is already known. The idea behind an argument is that there's a conclusion that is under dispute, and the premises are supposed to present evidence for the truth of that conclusion. This contrasts with appeals to authority. So suppose you have a conversation that goes like, "Well, I saw a documentary last night that the universe is expanding and will probably keep expanding forever." Really? Yeah, Stephen King said so. Stephen Hawking said so. Although I guess if Stephen King said that too, that'd be a good argument. So appeals to authority of this kind are arguments, I guess, but not very good ones. They're only as credible as the authority being cited, and that credibility is hopefully founded on some actual genuine evidence. And we're not going to want to say that the universe is expanding because Stephen Hawking says that it should expand. The universe should expand. Too soon? So, but again, don't get too hung up on these issues. Generally, when we're going to be looking at arguments and argument structure, I will tell you when it's an argument. And we're going to be analyzing the properties there. Okay. So if you want to look at some of these exercises here on identifying arguments, that's page 24 to 26. If the pagination is different, just go to the problems and practice exercises in section 1.4. So if you want to go have a look at that, pause the video and come right back. All right. So what did we talk about in chapter 1? Well, logic is concerned with the structure of good inference in the context of arguments. And importantly, logic is content neutral. So what does this mean? When we're dealing with logic, we're not talking about science or induction, statistics, rhetoric, persuasion. We're talking about something more abstract, more specific, the form of good argument. And form means that it's content neutral. What we're going to be looking at is not specific arguments about specific things in the world, but forms of arguments. Structures such that no matter what you place in the variable's rules, you're going to end up with a good argument. Logic is content neutral. It's about structure. What is an argument, however? An argument is a connected series of statements establishing a conclusion. And a statement is a sentence that could be true or false. Now, a good argument is such that the truth of the premises will guarantee the truth of the conclusion. This is known as validity. Again, what is a good, valid argument? If the premises are true, the conclusion would definitely follow. It would be guaranteed. Now, the premises is distinct from the conclusion. We present these in a standard form to reveal the underlying structure of the argument, how the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. However, not all connected statements are arguments. Exposition, narration, explanation are not forms of argument. Now, we're going to be moving on to chapter 2, so I'm going to stop the video here, and your next one is going to be coming right up.